Welcome everyone. My name is Andrea Kalea and I'm the Director of Learning at Salinger Privacy. I wish to start by acknowledging that while we are meeting virtually today, I speak to you from the land of the Cammeraygal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, as I welcome all of you here today. I also wish you a super happy Privacy Awareness Week. It's very exciting for a week for us in Australia. So our topic for today is data privacy and ethics. And our main speaker is Anna Johnston, who is the founder and principal of Salinger Privacy. Morning, Anna. We're also honoured to have a guest speaker with us from the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, or OAIC, Andre Castaldi, who will speak about community attitudes towards privacy. Andre is the Director of the Assessments section in the Regulation and Strategy branch of the OAIC. Now for the exciting stuff. Anna, over to you. Let's get the ball rolling.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, everyone. Welcome so much for joining us for our Privacy Awareness Week webinar for 2021. So our topic for today is all about secondary use of data. So we're not talking about using personal information for that immediate primary purpose your organisation might have collected it for, to treat a sick patient, to transport a passenger, to sell clothes online, to educate a student, whatever kind of business or government agency you're in. What we're talking about is what happens next when someone wants to use that data that you've got for a new, different purpose. Now, no matter whether you work in government or the private sector, your organisations are no doubt keen to maximise the benefits from your information assets in order to gain insights into how to best run your business or to support evidence-based decision-making. But those rules around secondary use of data are not always black and white. And if you start to throw ethical considerations and customer expectations into the mix as well, then the question becomes, well, how do we start? How do we frame our decision-making around this? We see this increasingly as a challenge for organisations which are keen to make the most out of their data. How do you make decisions about secondary data use, which are legal, ethical, respectful of your customers, and how do you make those decisions quickly and at scale? So how does the privacy officer or the privacy team, how can you assist in that process without creating a decision-making bottleneck? So we're going to explore today what the law says, what some ethical frameworks suggest, and what research about customer trust and community expectations can tell us. And then we're going to tell you, or show you rather, how to pull all of those things together to offer a pragmatic model that can help you work and make decisions even at scale. But to start us off, I'm going to hand over the mic now to Andre Castaldi from the OAIC, who is going to talk us through the OAIC's research into community attitudes towards privacy, which is a topic I'll then return to later as a theme in today's webinar. Okay, over to you, Andre.
Thanks so much, Anna. Had a slight technical glitch there, but I think I'm here and you can hear me. So I'd just like to start by thanking Salinger Privacy for the opportunity to speak to you today about the Australian Community Attitudes to Privacy Survey. So what is ACAPS? So this is a long-standing and detailed survey of how Australians feel about key privacy issues. We've been doing this research for many years with the aim of measuring changing attitudes and to learn more about emerging privacy issues. So this is a great resource for us, but also for the agencies and businesses that we regulate, principally because it helps to understand the community's expectations and views on the use and misuse of personal information. ACAPS also gives us insights into the steps that people may be taking to protect their privacy and their levels of trust in personal information handling practices. Last year, we surveyed almost 3,000 individuals over the age of 18 for the main survey. And we also did a follow-up survey in April following the commencement of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the survey sought the views of respondents about their levels of trust in relation to personal information handling. And overall, and consistent with other surveys such as the Edelman Trust Barometer, we're seeing a general decline in trust in personal information handling by sector. So trust in federal government departments is down by 14% since 2007. And similarly, trust in companies is in general is down by 13%. This confirms our view that there's some work to be done here by entities to build this consumer trust. So we also asked respondents about incidents of negative privacy experiences. And the survey tells us that the decline in trust and Australians' concerns about privacy are in part driven by their experiences, particularly negative experiences. So the majority, 59% of the respondents, experienced problems with the handling of their personal information in the year leading up to the survey. And most of these negative experiences related to unwanted marketing communications, with 43% telling us that their personal information was either used for unsolicited direct marketing or they couldn't unsubscribe from marketing communications. The survey also considered misuse of personal information, which is particularly relevant to today's discussion when we're thinking about secondary uses. And respondents were asked whether they considered certain data practices to be a misuse of their personal information. We found that the Australians on this topic have quite strong views, and the vast majority considered that all the data practices that we measured in the survey were actually a misuse. And so by way of example, this includes instances where organisations were using personal information for a different purpose to the purpose it was collected for, where organisations collected information about individuals in ways they wouldn't expect, or where an organisation is asking for information that doesn't seem relevant, and recording information about the websites and individual visits without their knowledge. So what about the practices of different types of entities? So the survey shows us Australia's comfort with data practices depends on the type of information being collected, the purpose behind the collection, and the level of trust in the organisation involved. Generally, government's use of personal information is less likely to make Australians uncomfortable than business use of personal information. And Australians appear to be more comfortable with data practices where the purpose is clearly understood. For example, law enforcement using facial recognition and video surveillance to identify suspects. Considering business use of data, commercial profiling activities generally drive higher levels of discomfort among Australians. And that includes businesses tracking their location through mobiles or web browsers, with 62% of respondents indicating they're uncomfortable with this practice. Also, it's noteworthy that individuals are generally reluctant to provide biometric information, with 66% of respondents indicating they're uncomfortable with this. So how can you find out some more about ACAPs? Well, you can visit our website at www.oaic.gov.au/ACAPS 2020. And you'll find it's a significant piece of work, and there's insights in relation to a wide range of areas, including things like privacy legislation, location data, biometric information, artificial intelligence, children's privacy, and also COVID-19. So with that, I'll hand back to Anna, and if there are any questions, we can take them at the end of the session.
Thank you so much, Andre. And I'm sure there will be questions for you at the end of the session about how organisations should respond to the findings of the OAIC surveys. Now, here's something that really struck me about the ACAP's findings. Among the practices most likely to be considered a misuse is when information supplied for a specific purpose is then used for another purpose. So in other words, any secondary use of personal information is likely to raise community concerns. Of course, this is precisely why privacy law sets limits on secondary use of data. So let's start by looking at the law now. So when you are thinking about secondary data use within your organisation, the privacy principles that you will need to think about include general limitations on use, any special rules that you have about using particular types of personal information, whether that is, say, for example, sensitive information or government-issued unique identifiers. Your jurisdiction might have special rules around that. Any special rules you've got about using personal information for a particular purpose, such as direct marketing, you might have special rules about that. You also need to think about data quality as relevant for your proposed data use proposal, and of course, data security. Now, I've taken the APPs from the Australian Privacy Act for my examples on screen here, but most privacy laws say fairly similar things. And of critical importance is the fact that the rules about use and disclosure of personal information typically turn on a distinction between the primary purpose and the secondary purpose for that use and disclosure. So if your proposed data use can be described as related to the primary purpose for which your organisation collected the personal information in the first place, you should have already cleared that first hurdle. Now, sometimes depending on your jurisdiction and the precise law, the legal requirement might be that it is directly related rather than just related, such as under APP 6 if you're proposing to use sensitive information. Remember also, please, that in your jurisdiction, you might have slightly different tests. So please be mindful of that too. So for example, under the New South Wales statute, PIPA, for some types of personal information, sensitive personal information, disclosure even for a directly related secondary purpose is not allowed. So for data attributes such as religion, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on, disclosure under PIPA, the New South Wales law, will require either the consent of the individual or a waiver of that need for consent issued by a Human Research Ethics Committee operating under a particular exemption for research in the public interest. But for most of you, however, that first hurdle that you need to meet is that the proposed data use must be related or directly related to the primary purpose for which your organisation collected the data in the first place. So what does that actually mean? If we look at the OAIC guidelines, for example, that advises us that a related secondary purpose must be connected to or associated with the primary purpose, and it must be more than a tenuous link between the two. So that's the first hurdle. But we've also got the second hurdle. The secondary purpose must also typically be within the reasonable expectations of the individual. This test is based on what the reasonable or a reasonable individual in the circumstances with no special knowledge of the industry or the activity involved, what they would agree to as a proposed data use. So again, if you turn to the OAIC guidelines, they advise that examples of where an individual may reasonably expect that their information will be used for a secondary purpose include normal business practice, such as auditing, business planning, and billing. The New South Wales Privacy Commissioner, their guidelines have suggested that things like program or service evaluation will also tend to fit into this category. And from research such as the ACAPS surveys and other forms of research about community attitudes, we can start to make educated guesses about what else will or won't be reasonably expected by your customers. Now, while in this webinar we are focused on the use of personal information, and therefore APP 6 or equivalent state or territory privacy laws, when you are planning or assessing a data use proposal, don't just stop there. You will also need to consider data security and data quality and your compliance with those principles in particular. So why those two? Because in my experience, data custodians are often concerned about data security. So this is because typically, unless you've got some really sophisticated data enclaves set up or other techniques, typically getting access to data actually means getting a copy of the data. And data custodians know that granting access by way of supplying a copy of data raises the likelihood that the data could be lost or misused. And in particular, that the data could be then reused by the recipient, not just for this new approved purpose, but for other unapproved purposes. So data custodians are clearly concerned about data security, but we find they also tend to be concerned about data quality risks. Data analysis needs proper methodology and understanding of the limitations of the data in play, as well as the context in which it was collected and how the results of any analysis should be interpreted. So either poor quality data or data that's not fit for a proposed analytics purpose, for example, or program evaluation purpose, or having poor understandings about the limitations of the data or poor understanding about statistical methodologies, all of these things can lead to poor quality decision-making with financial and reputational risks for your organisations. So that's why we see data custodians as concerned about the data quality principle as well. So all of those privacy principles need to be included in your decision-making about any particular data use proposal. And in particular, remembering within that legal test for secondary use of personal information, there is that sort of extra within reasonable expectations element to be considered. And that means that the context of your proposed data use will be really critical. So we'll see shortly how that context can be reflected and built into your decision-making framework. But first, well, we've looked at the law, which tells us what we can or can't do with personal information. But how can an organisation answer the more complex question, should we do it? So I'd like to draw out some decision-making frameworks that any organisation can apply when helping to answer that question. Now, ethical frameworks are all very nice, but most of the ones I've seen only focus on one kind of application, such as artificial intelligence. And even then, they tend to be pretty vague. So one example is the Australian government set of 8 AI ethics principles, which comprise motherhood statements like AI systems should respect and uphold privacy rights and data protection and ensure the security of data. Now, when you drill down deeper to find out, well, how you're supposed to do that in practice, the only suggestion that that document makes for how to maintain privacy is to use appropriate data anonymisation. So nothing super helpful there. I must say the New South Wales government's AI ethics documents are better. At least they commit to some firm statements like, we as the government will not make unilateral decisions using AI about people's or that affect people's rights, and they've committed to only using AI for community benefit. So there are some documents you can look at. Oh, I might ask everyone, especially the person with the barking dog, to please mute themselves. Okay, so of course you could adopt some mottos like do no harm, don't be evil, or be fair, but these are meaningless if you don't have a shared understanding of what harm means or what fairness looks like or how you go about defining and measuring these things. Anyway, so, what does fairness mean? Does it mean that you're not going to discriminate unlawfully? Or does it mean something better than that, like you're actively going to promote diversity and inclusivity? So short of hiring some ethicists full time, you're going to need something way more concrete to help you make decisions about every given data use proposal, instead of just throwing around words like fair and ethical and hoping that they magically translate into something meaningful. So now let's look at what we can tell from research about what people actually want and expect, which might just actually set us on the path to being ethical in how we use their personal information. So research into the interplay between customer trust and social license starts to give us some ideas about what to do and what to avoid. A multi-year 8-nation research project by the World Economic Forum in conjunction with Microsoft sought to measure the impact of context on individuals' attitudes towards privacy and the use of their personal information. And their research made 2 critical findings. First, that there are 4 types of factors which influence any given individual's degree of trust in any particular data use proposal. And those 4 factors are illustrated in the diagram shown here. So the first is the situational context. So the nature of the data use proposal itself, and we're going to talk more about that one in a moment. The second is perceptions. This is about the individual consumer's beliefs about the strengths of legal protections available to them. So how will they feel protected by the law in their country, for example, as well as about their own personal level of confidence navigating technology. The third factor is culture. So local cultural norms in the country you are operating in also play a part. And the fourth factor is demographics. So research has shown that an individual's gender, age, ethnicity, and country of origin, as opposed to the country they're in now, can each influence the value they place on privacy. So think about this from an organisational point of view. You only have control over the first of these 4 factors, the situational context. The others are already set in place for you. And the second lesson learned from that research project is that in terms of the situational context, there are 7 variables that individuals think about when determining whether they would accept any given scenario involving the use of their personal information. So they think about the type of data. So is it medical? Is it financial? Is it location data, for example? They think about the type of entity seeking to use that data. Is it the government? Is it their employer? Is it their retailer? Is it a bank? The degree of trust in that entity type. So do we trust government in general? Do we trust banks in general, etc.? Including whether or not they have an existing relationship with that particular entity. So am I already a customer of that retailer, for example? They also consider the device type used for the transaction. So there's a difference here between mobile and desktop use, for example. They also care about the method by which the data was collected, the degree to which the individual, that they as an individual can affect that data usage, and the sense of value exchange. And this means both whether any benefits will be delivered to them personally or to the wider community. So when you look at this, interestingly, the single most important of those 7 variables which affect the acceptability of a data use scenario was not the type of data at issue or the way it was proposed to be used, let alone the type of organisational institution seeking to use it, or even the pre-existing level of trust enjoyed by that particular organisation proposing the project. The single most important variable was the method by which the personal information was originally collected. So for me, this insight is really useful. The collection method is critical to trust. So an individual's ability to control how his or her personal information may be used depends on both an awareness of the collection and control over that collection. As awareness and control over collection lessen, so too does trust in any subsequent use of that data. So when you think about it, in terms of the method of collection, any given set of personal information may be broadly categorised as having been provided or observed or generated. And within generated, I'm including inferred data. The table here illustrates those 3 broad categories with some examples. So understanding how personal information was collected therefore becomes critical to understanding the likely community expectations around the subsequent use of that data. So when you think about data analytics, especially data analytics involving linkage from third-party sources or making inferences or predictions about people, we can now see is already suffering from the lowest trust level. So how can an organisation gain its social licence to use personal information? How do you build trust in your project? How do you know if you will be operating within reasonable expectations? In addition to addressing the variables highlighted in that World Economic Forum research that I've just talked about, you should think about transparency. A few years ago, a New Zealand body called the Data Futures Partnership conducted some really interesting qualitative research using consultation with thousands of New Zealanders about different data use scenarios and what is needed to improve their level of trust. And not surprisingly, they found that trust leads to comfort with a proposed data use, and that comfort or acceptance or acceptability is referred to as social license. Now, that research also found, similar to the World Economic Forum research, that people feel more comfortable if they understand the value of what would be created by any given data use proposal, whether that is value for them as an individual or to the broader community. And their other key finding was that being transparent around how data is proposed to be used is a crucial step towards gaining that social license. In particular, customers and citizens expect clear answers to 8 key questions. What will my data be used for? What are the benefits and who will benefit? Who will be using my data? And within that, answering that question, you should answer the question with reference to whether there will be data linkage, and if so, with what data from where else. Is my data secure? Will my data be anonymous? Can I see and correct the data held about me? Will I be asked for my consent? And could my data be sold? Now, answering these questions is not about helping you tease out all the potential risks of your project. So you still need a privacy risk assessment about your data use proposal. But together, these 8 questions suggest both how to think about what might fall within that reasonable expectations legal test, but also how to frame your communications with your customers and stakeholders. That New Zealand research also suggested that extra community engagement will be needed in certain circumstances, such as if the project will have or is likely to have a substantial impact on vulnerable, disadvantaged, or low trust communities, if the project will have a serious impact on people's lives, for example, decisions about access to housing or mortgages, if the project will use sensitive information, or if your organisation is starting from what they describe as a low level of trust, such as following a serious breach of data security. So we've talked about some of the research. Now let's talk about how do you pull all of that knowledge together in practice. So thinking about what is lawful, what will avoid causing privacy harm, what will be ethical, and what your customers might expect and what they will trust. How do you structure that to guide your decision making? And how do you do that at scale? How do you build decision-making capability across your organisation? So it's not just the privacy officer having to figure out the answer to these questions every time. So if it's not just the privacy officer, who should approve internal requests to access or use data, and what criteria should they use to make their decision? So I will take you through what we have done for a number of clients who have large amounts of data, often in enterprise data warehouses or data lakes, and lots of demand from across their organisations to access and use that corporate data. Because a common problem we've seen for our clients is this. You've got a large amount of data coming from lots of different source systems and perhaps a different data custodian in charge of each one. You've got pressure from senior executives to make better use of that data. You've got data requesters, meaning people from across your organisation or external who want access to the data you've got, and they're pestering the data custodians with requests all the time. But those data custodians are busy, or they're nervous about making a mistake about compliance with privacy law, or they're concerned about whether a data requester's proposal is going to create risks for the organisation, whether that is legal compliance risks, data security risks, reputation risks, and so on. Quite often, the privacy team or legal, risk and compliance are stuck in the middle with people pulling on all sides. And when that privacy team or others are stuck in the middle like that, when they're swamped or suffering from decision paralysis, this creates a bottleneck. Or the privacy team becomes so risk averse that they get the reputation as the people who just say no. And either way, data requesters start sidestepping them entirely, which just makes things even worse. So what to do? Well, privacy risks, as we have seen, are highly contextual. So we recommend taking a risk management approach, which reflects and adapts to the circumstances of each data use request. You'll need a clear, layered, scalable risk assessment framework. So ideally, major risk points should be identified as early as possible so they can either be mitigated or the project abandoned entirely before too much energy has been expended on it. However, expecting a comprehensive privacy impact assessment for every data use proposal may not be feasible if you're operating at any kind of scale. So some form of triaging will be necessary. So we have developed a framework for thinking about privacy risks and the harms to avoid in a structured way. We did that by building criteria to help quickly triage data use requests into 3 approval streams. The criteria reflect the law and ethics and community expectations by anticipating the factors that will impact on trust and social license. Using a set of clear and published risk indicators should significantly streamline the risk assessment process for you and improve transparency and accountability of decision making for your stakeholders. But you still need to decide who should approve the request to use data and using what criteria. So that's where the triaged approval pathways come in. So building on work we've done for a number of clients, we have developed a model data use protocol. So a data use protocol here means something that offers a clear pathway for decision-making about requests to use personal information. The protocol should offer clarity and pragmatic guidance to both data requesters and data custodians. It should include a simple flowchart or decision tree type guide through the lawful options available for using personal information, so setting out the legal tests, a set of risk-based criteria, a principles-based framework for decision-making for each of the tiered approval pathways, and rules around what data governance is necessary and what level of support is available for each of those tiered pathways. So in our model protocol, for example, a set of clear risk indicators is used to channel data use requests into these tiered approval pathways. So we have what we call amber and red flags. So if you have an amber flag, this suggests the need for some caution, ethical consideration, or additional risk mitigation controls, while red flags suggest higher level risks needing even stricter controls or possible reasons not to proceed at all. Then we have the three different approval pathways. We've called them the minimum, the enhanced, and the comprehensive approval pathways. And these reflect the degree of risk posed by any given data use proposal. And they offer clarity about who should be involved in the approval process, the criteria involved in granting approval, the conditions to be placed on data use, and the degree of ongoing oversight needed for any given data use proposal. So to develop a data use protocol, first you should build your list of risk criteria. Some of those criteria will be the same across many types of organisations, while others will be more tailored to suit you. So here the presence of any red flags means higher risk, and therefore that data use proposal will need to follow what we describe as the most comprehensive, the strictest approval pathway. While if you have no red flags, but some amber flags, that means a project is medium level risk and should follow the enhanced approval pathway. If a data use proposal raises no flags at all, then it is inherently lower risk and can proceed along the minimum approval pathway. So here at Salinger Privacy, we've developed a very long list of factors which will raise what we describe as either a red or amber flag. So by way of example, in our model data use protocol, we've got a long list of types of data which raise red flags. Things like data protected by secrecy rules in other legislation. So for example, child protection reports. Types of data like biometrics, data about law enforcement activities or criminal activities, data that could lead to re-identification because the individual might be unique in the data set. So for example, behavioural pattern data or telecommunications metadata, text-based fields and unstructured data, and for government agencies, any data classified as protected or above. So there's some ideas about what might create a data red flag. We also look at some of the features of the nature of a data use project. So beyond just focusing on the nature of the data itself. So some project red flags might be if there's going to be data linkage with data obtained from outside this organisation, or if the intention is to publish the results of the analysis. So if any given project has any of those red flags, the project would be channeled into the most comprehensive approval pathway and have the most stringent conditions attached to the proposals or the project's approval. Some types of data amber flags might be things like health information or ethnicity data. Now, I'm not saying that ethnicity data, for example, can't be used, simply that if you have this as part of your data use proposal, then additional consideration is warranted. For example, the assessment and approval process might look at a project and say, well, we don't think it's ethical to analyse patient outcomes according to the ethnicity of their doctor. But the patient's Indigenous status is relevant for a project which is attempting to measure the gap in outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous patients in the health system. Other data amber flags might include data that was indirectly collected, generated, or inferred. So, for example, data generated from online behavioural tracking or profiling. So remembering what we learned earlier about how the method of collection impacts on trust. So indirect collection should raise at least an amber flag. Or, for example, data collected in an environment in which the data subjects may believe they were given particular promises about privacy or confidentiality, or where they might not expect any kind of secondary use. So an example here, imagine the New South Wales government's COVID check-in app, which is compulsory for certain businesses and venues to use. When launching the app, the relevant minister promised that the data collected by the government by that app would not be used for any purpose except for COVID contact tracing. But there was no specific legislation put in place to put that promise into concrete just for that particular app. So what if you're in the relevant department and you got a data use proposal to now use the data collected by the COVID check-in app for a secondary purpose? Like, could you use that data to track economic recovery in the hospitality sector after a local lockdown? If you looked only at the privacy principles around secondary use, that alone may not stop this proposal, because you could probably argue that this is a related secondary purpose. So that's why you actually want to look beyond the law and look at these risk criteria further. Thinking about that example, to allow this type of data use proposal would likely risk a breach of trust with the public, and the flow and effects of that breach of trust could then undermine public health outcomes if that loss of trust led to lower compliance rates by either venues or patrons. So your data amber flags should help you to call out that kind of risk, which you wouldn't see if you looked at the law and the legal tests alone. And some other project amber flags might include, for example, if there's more than one data custodian who should be consulted, or if the question to be answered by the proposed data use is itself not well articulated. So you're building your data use protocol. Now that the data custodian and the data requester both have that long list of red and amber flags in front of them, you can also give them a decision assistance tree, which makes it really easy for them to see which of the 3 tiered approval pathways should be followed for any given data use proposal. Now, obviously, that flowchart or decision tree needs to reflect the correct legal tests in your jurisdiction. So the example I've given here is a flowchart reflecting the privacy laws regulated in New South Wales Public Sector Agency. And in your data use protocol, you should also spell out in more detail what some of the phrases I've got in bold here mean, like what does directly related secondary purpose mean, as with some examples relevant to your organisation. So now we come to the role of the tiered approval pathways. The issues to resolve for each of your 3 pathways will be, well, who should assess this proposal and approve it? What criteria should they base their decision on? Figuring out who as individuals actually deserve to get access to the data, what conditions should be placed on the use of that data, and what kind of ongoing data governance or oversight is required. So you've tiered your proposal into one of the 3 pathways. Who should approve it? You might say, if you're in the minimum pathway, you might say only the privacy team needs to look at this and document their approval. If you're in that middle enhanced pathway, you might say, well, the privacy team and the affected data custodians each need to review and document their approval of this proposal. And if you're in that more stringent, comprehensive pathway, you'd say, well, we need to do those other things, plus also add the documented approval of a senior executive, like, say, the Chief Data Officer. So that's who needs to approve, but what criteria should they be using? So in that minimum level pathway, you might say, well, we just need to confirm that we've met the requirements as set out in that decision tree approach. So we want to confirm we've met the directly related secondary purpose test and that there are no red or amber flags for this particular proposal. In the middle enhanced pathway, the assessment would again confirm we've met the directly related secondary purpose test. We've got no red flags, even though we've got amber flags, we've got no red flags. And now we want some documented consideration of some extra things. So maybe you want to consider direct privacy risks that will be posed to data subjects or other individuals, reputational risks for your organisation. What are the costs and benefits of this proposal, including opportunity cost? And how does this align or not to our policy or strategic objectives? And in that most stringent pathway, the comprehensive one, you'll say, well, we need to consider all of those things plus some more. So you might want to build in, for example, ethical considerations as set out in the NHMRC's National Statement on Ethical Research Involving Humans. So that talks about things like respect for human beings, research merit, and integrity, justice, and beneficence. You'll also want to apply the relevant tests from the Privacy Commissioner guidelines in your jurisdiction. So, for example, will the public interest in the proposal substantially outweigh the public interest in the protection of privacy? When applicable, you might say we also need to consider the NHMRC's ethical guidelines for research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And also you might say, well, we'll also need to seek legal advice if there is a concern about whether the proposal meets the directly related secondary purpose test, or if there is a risk of other legislation being breached. And now thinking about who is actually going to get access to that data. It's not only the data that needs to be fit for purpose, but also the people who will be accessing and using that data. This is the idea of safe people. You need to ensure that you have staff with data literacy and that you have ways to assess their data literacy. So data analysts, the people who are going to get access to the data, they need both data literacy in the sense of statistical understanding, but also understanding of the organisation's context and needs. So we suggest taking that same tiered approval pathway approach to assessing and measuring for the level of data capability required of the data requesters. So, for example, in that minimum level pathway, you'd say, well, this only requires a minimum level of user permission. We might say the data requester just needs to pass an online training module about privacy, data security, data quality, and basic statistical methodologies. In the middle level, you might say this level user permission is as before, as for the minimum, but we're going to add the data requester also needs to offer up some details of their qualifications, experience, or training in data science or statistical methodologies. And at that high level of analysis or high level risk proposals rather, the permission will be as before, but add on the data requester then needs to actually pass a rigorous test of their statistical and analytical skills. So that's who gets access. How about what conditions should be placed on access to and use of the data? The minimum and enhanced pathways, you might say, we're just going to give you some standard conditions that touch on data security and data quality, while at the upper end of the scale, the comprehensive pathway, this will require something like a formal signed data release agreement to include tailored conditions for this proposal. You might have conditions like, well, we're requiring that there be no publication of this data, for example. And finally, ongoing data governance. The minimum and middle level, you might say, well, here the privacy officer or privacy team can check compliance with the conditions and offer support as required on an as needs basis. While for those high risk projects in the comprehensive pathway, you might say, well, this requires actually a collaborative project team, needs to be established, include the data custodians and subject matter experts. And the point of that project team would be to help guide the analysis and interpret the results. You might also require that that project team must review the outputs of the analysis and any research reports in order to test the validity of conclusions before those outputs are shared with any other party. So now you've developed your data use protocol. What next? obviously you need a process to operationalize that data use protocol. So for example, you might use a request form for data use for each initiation of a data use proposal. And if you're doing that, then the request form, it would be useful to warn data requesters that there are particular types of data which have extra sensitivity and thus increase the degree of privacy risk involved, and that the presence of anything like an amber or red flag as listed in your data use protocol will therefore mean that the approval process they will have to go through for their particular proposal will be at the more complex end of the scale and slower. The request form should encourage data requesters to review the data use protocol prior to submitting their request. And then the request form can ask specifically about each of the amber or red data flags to test if they are within the scope of the data requested. For example, does your proposal need to include data about Aboriginality? And other questions should yield answers about the project, which enable the assessor to determine whether any red or amber project flags are raised. For example, will your data use proposal involve linking data obtained from a third party? So we've spoken today about this pressing question facing so many organisations. How can we make decisions about secondary data use which are legal and ethical and respectful of our customers? And how can we make those decisions at scale without creating bottlenecks? Our answer is that you need a way of pulling together the various factors we have discussed. The legal tests around secondary use of personal information, of course, but also community attitudes towards privacy, the factors influencing customer trust, and you need to think deeply about ethical considerations and privacy harms. A data use protocol can offer a framework to assist decision-making at scale. We've developed our model data use protocol, which sets out a long list of risk indicators, which we categorise as red or amber flags. Using that list of indicators allows data use proposals to be quickly triaged according to the inherent risk level posed. And the presence of any red or amber flags in any particular data use proposal will then suggest what is the approval pathway to follow. Within each of the three pathways, there are rules about who needs to approve the project based on what criteria and what kinds of conditions should be placed on the project if it is approved. And all of those depend on the inherent level of risk proposed by the project. So those risk criteria have been developed to reflect not just legal compliance considerations like special rules about sensitive information, but also those factors we saw from research that impact on community attitudes and customer trust. And speaking of those research sources, we will email you links to the research referred to in both Andre's and my presentations today, in case you're interested to know more. And if you would like to get your hands on our model data use protocol, it is included as a template in a number of our compliance kits. And in fact, I'm actually really excited to let you know ahead of the official launch next week that we now have 13 new packages of resources available. So during 2020, we asked privacy professionals across Australia what you need to do your job well. We asked some of our past customers what worked for them and what didn't and what they want more of. And here's what we found. Privacy officers from organisations of all shapes and sizes value pragmatic tools and our know-how like checklists, briefing papers and templates. Lawyers in particular love our legislation handbooks. The founders of startups want templates to help them get things right from the start, and everyone wanted more flexibility in choosing the right set of resources for them. So once we'd finished that listening exercise, we started building, and the result I'm thrilled to let you know is that we have 13 new sets of privacy resources available just in time for Privacy Awareness Week. So whether you need the basics for a startup, advice about a particular risk area, plain language walkthrough guides to the law, or resources to help you stand up a comprehensive privacy management program, we have guidance and tools to suit. They're tailored to 3 different sectors: Australian government agencies, businesses and non-profits, which is what you can see on the screen here, and the New South Wales public sector, including local councils and universities. For example, the model data use protocol I've mentioned today is included as a template document in the using and disclosing data package, as well as in the everything for businesses and NFPs option. And we have a different version of that protocol tailored for New South Wales public sector agencies as well. So to find out more about this new range of resources, please have a look at our website under compliance kits. And as a special treat for those of you watching this webinar today, we have a discount code you can use for 10% off until the end of May. Appropriately, that code is POUR2021. Well, that concludes the formal part of our presentation. So I'll hand over to my colleague, Andrea, who will now moderate the Q&A session.
Hi, Anna. Thank you. Thank you very much both to you and Andre for the presentations today. And I'm sure that people have taken away a lot of nuggets of your wisdom, Anna. Now, while people are entering their questions in, I just would like to briefly mention that Salinger Privacy offers a range of privacy training, including as an official training partner of the IAPP, through which we offer the SIP-M course, the SIP-T course, and the SIP-E courses. And our next program will be SIP-T starting on the 31st of May. Also, mark your diaries for a future event, which will be an IAPP Knowledge Net on the 15th of June, which will look at what privacy officers need to know about AI, algorithms, and automated decision making. If you're an IAPP member, get onto the IAPP website to register for that event. Now, let's see what juicy questions have come in for Anna and Andre. There are some definitely coming in. There's some that we received earlier as well. Andre, I might ask you, please, to start. You with us, Andre?
I am, yes.
Lovely. First question for you. What are some of the key takeaways from the ACAPS survey or ACAP survey?
Well, I think the biggest headline takeaway would be that privacy is a major concern for many Australians. I think, the other key takeaways is around the significant percentage of respondents who felt, who expressed views about misuse of their data. And that becomes particularly apparent when there's any suggestion that the misuse may cause harm. I think, there's also commentary in there around steps that businesses can take in relation to giving individuals more control. So thinking about things like privacy policies, but also noting that generally the public are receptive to broader privacy laws and additional rights and that sort of thing. So I think they're the key headlines. And then if you think about businesses and the government, I mean, one thing that really stood out for me in relation to businesses is that there's a particular stat in there around that individuals now consider privacy to be one of the top considerations when they're choosing a digital service. So ahead of reliability, convenience, and price, which I think is quite significant. And then in terms of government, I think what the survey is telling us is that there is a level of trust that's higher in government than in relation to business in the context of protection of personal information. And the public will accept certain uses of personal information to be more legitimate than others. And an example there is public safety, and I think we've seen that play out through the pandemic.
Thanks, Andre. Anna, one for you.
Mm-hmm.
What is the best place for resources on data ethics if one is trying to set up a function from scratch?
Oh, good question. I'm not sure I have a great answer. I'm looking at this stuff all the time. And as I said before, a lot of the kind of ethical guidelines I see are either they just restate the law, or worse, they just gloss over legal requirements as if they were nice to have. So my advice is to, even before you start talking about ethics, make sure you're going to comply with existing laws. So privacy laws, obviously, but also anti-discrimination laws, consumer protection laws. So thinking about, this AI and algorithm space, for example, making sure that the algorithms that your government agency or your business is using to make decisions, making sure that those algorithms are fair, that they're not resulting in discriminatory outcomes, making sure that they're not misleading, making sure that the data is fit for purpose. All of these are existing legal requirements, not ethical nice-to-haves. So my advice is always start with the law. The one set of sources that I turn to, both for compliance with privacy law if a client is operating under a research exemption, but more broadly, as I mentioned, is the NHMRC's guidelines. So, and some of those are actually issued under the Federal Privacy Act under Section 95 and 95A, but they also have guidelines separately, and the national statement involving ethical conduct, on ethical conduct involving humans, human research is also just sort of generally useful, even if you are not operating in that sort of traditional research, academic research, clinical research kind of mode. I think it's still quite useful if you want general advice on what will be considered ethical versus what will not, in the context of data about human beings.
Thanks, Anna. An interesting one, which I think is quite an easy one for you, Anna. Should we have a different decision-making framework for customers of the business and employees of the business?
Yeah, so if we're talking about data about staff versus data about customers, yes, certainly some of the considerations will be different. I would err on the side of having one protocol which tried to cover both. Certainly, a number of our clients are looking at data use proposals which mix together staff data with customer data. So that example I gave of, are we, in the health sector, for example, we want data about patients, but we're also looking at data about the treating clinicians. So, are we looking at patient outcomes based on age of the clinician or length of experience or which hospital they're at, for example. In the education sector, we are looking at student outcomes in conjunction with data about the actual teachers. So I probably wouldn't actually separate them out into two different protocols. I would have one protocol that grapples with the implications of data about staff as well as data about customers. But some of those, so some of the sort of protocols we've built for some of our clients, those amber or risk flags will reflect things like, if the information about staff is coming from your incident management or your work health and safety response system, for example, that's going to raise either an amber or red flag.
Well, that brings us to the end of the event today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and a very warm thank you to Andre and Anna for spending their time in such a busy week to share their knowledge with us all. So from all of us here at Salinger Privacy, I'd like to, again, thank you very much and wish you a happy second half of Privacy Awareness Week. Have a great one.